So if you've taken a look at what we've done so far, you realize that we have like a lot of things happening within this file, right? And if I want to run, maybe if I want to calculate velocity, right? If I want to do this calculation, this is going to run first before I get to this. And eventually we have to run into this as well. So if I want to run this particular piece of code, it means this is going to execute, then followed by this. I have to calculate velocity just because I want to get see if a particular user is qualified for a ride. So this is not the ideal way of writing any program. It's good for you to break your programs down into smaller reusable chunks, which is what a function is. So a function is just a block of code that performs a particular action, that does a particular thing. So in this case now, if we look at this, we have a piece of code that tells us what data type a particular variable is. So we can change this now by creating a function. So to create a function, you start with the def keyword because we're trying to define a function. Then the function name. So we can call this check. Let me use this pattern, check data type. Then we can now have this open and close brackets. So these open and close brackets, you can pass arguments here. I'm going to show you guys that next. So we can now have this. I'll take this and put this within this block. So now a block of code in Python just basically means from where you see this colon to the end to the last line. That's the block of code within this particular function. So now we have a function called check data type. So let me comment out all these other piece of code so that we just have this. So if we run this now, if we run this, that's executed, but we have no result. It's not printing this, right? So that's because whenever you create a function, for you to use that function, you have to call it, right? So here we created a function by saying define or def check data type. Then we have open and close brackets. So we can pass in arguments here. Then we have the colon, then we have the block. Now we have to call the function. So how do we call the function? So you just call the function by just stating this name and the open and close bracket. So I can now say check data type. So at this stage now, we are now calling this particular function. So if I run this here now, we should see that same class bool, right? Now, if you run this function, wherever you run this function, it's always going to give you the same result. What if you want to check for different data types, right? Different variables. So now we can now pass, instead of us writing this here, this is false is equal to false, we can create a test variable or a variable. We can just call this test variable. So this is now an argument, right? Now instead of having this here, now we can now have our test variable. So whatever variable is supplied to this is what we now print out the results for. So let's run this now. So we have an error, right? Like I said, whenever you see an error, it doesn't mean you should panic or anything. So now let's read the error. Type error, check data type, missing one required positional argument, test variable, where at line 4, right? So what it's telling us is this this method has, or this function has a variable here, and it expects you that whenever you call this particular function, you have to pass in what that variable is. So if I pass in 7, for example, and I run this, it has now told that 7 is of type integer. If I pass in 7.7 and I run this, you now see that this is of type float in this case, right? So similarly, I can create a variable. I can just say my variable is equal to input, let's see, enter name. Then I can pass in, instead of me hard coding this value, I can pass in this my variable here. And when you run this primer, to actually enter your name, and just say John, and John is of type string, right? So this is basically how you create functions. So we have this function to check this, so to check the data type. Then for us to create a function, we use this define keyword, then the name of the function, then open and close brackets that can hold arguments for that particular function. So arguments typically or essentially can be variables that are needed to for certain operations to work. So let's do another example. So let's say we have this velocity is equal to distance over time. So I'll come here. Let's see. So let me uncomment this code now. So for us to calculate velocity, we need distance and time. So now we're going to create a function. So we'll say def. Name of the function will be calculate velocity. Then here now we now pass in the required arguments that we need. We need distance, we need time. So then you end the definition now with a colon. So you have this error here because Python is very, very sensitive with indentation and space, right? So after this, you can't start the next line here. You have to say that something is within this function. So at this stage now, we only have one line in this function, which is this particular line. This is the only one within the function. So we can add all the others by indenting them. So I'm just using tab to indent. So you can either use tab or you can use spaces, but the best way is you delete, you come back here and you press enter to take you to the new line. That way the IDE, like in this case PyCharm will take you back to the appropriate position. If not, you may have to just type space a couple of times. I think it's 4 times, right? 1 2 3 4 to get that indentation. So we've moved our code now into a function, right? Into our calculate velocity function, and to calculate our velocity we need distance and we need time. Also, your functions can return certain values. So after the operation is done, you can decide to return values. So you can say return distance divided by time, right? So this is now going to return the value of the velocity. So at the end of this operation is now going to return this particular value. So we've created our function, we've written the operation and so on. The next thing we need to do now is to call our function. So I can now say calculate velocity, and now PyCharm is telling me that we need to enter distance and we need to enter time, right? So what I'll just do is I'll just hard code. Okay, let me just do this instead of hard coding. Let me take out this piece of code. Then I'll take out this one as well. So the reason why I had to move the code for distance and time out of the function is because if we're going to use them when we call the function, right? And if they are within this scope, they won't be accessible outside the function. So that's why I had to do that. So they will be local to the function. So any variable within a function is considered a local variable, and the ones that are within the file itself, they are globally accessible within the Python file. So to make things easier for me, I'll just comment out the call to this function, so that when I run it now, it's only we start from here. So let's run this code. So enter distance traveled, let's say 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers, and let's say that was done in 1600 seconds. So we have our velocity. We have this code that checks the type for distance, but we have our velocity here, right? Which is what was printed here. But now, since we have a return statement, what I can do is I can actually print out the value of the return statement. So let me comment out this print statement. So I'll put this now within the print. So we are doing this because we are returning this value. So whatever is returned, we can now print it. So let's run this again and see. Distance traveled, say 40,600. So you see we have our value here. So since this is returning number, if we like, we can do mathematical operations with it. I can say times 3. So let's run this 43,600. You can see we've multiplied the original value by 3. That's because at this stage we are returning a numerical value, which originally is 0.0111111 something like that, 11112, right? So since that's a number, we can do mathematical operations with it. So what I would just want to make clear here now is a function is a block of code that performs a particular action. So if you look at this now, the only job of this function is to calculate what? Distance divided by time, which is velocity. Just to calculate velocity, you shouldn't do too many things within your function. So that's the definition of a function. Then to create a function, you use the def keyword, calculate, then the name of the function, in this case calculate velocity. In the previous one it was check data type. Then you have open and close brackets if there are no arguments required for that particular operation. But in this operation now, we need the value of distance and we need the value of time. So we now say this function should return distance divided by time, which is the formula for our velocity, right? So once we do that now, we now have to call the function. So this is where we call the function here. So when you call the function, you now have to supply the value of distance and the value of time in this case, just like in this other situation where we called check data, we had to find the value of my variable, which will now replace this test variable, right? So when we enter name here, the name that was entered was stored in my variable, which was now passed back here and now used to print the type of that data, which was a string. So similarly here, the distance that is entered here will now match with this, and the time that is entered here will now match with this. So the order also that you pass it is important. If you swap this now, if I put time, I put distance here, distance here, it means we've ruined the calculation, because what it's going to do now is the value of time will now be here, the value of distance will now be here, and the operation now will now be backwards. So let's run that also to see. So we have 40 and we have let's use the same value. So you can see this is not the right thing, right? So this is so this basically functions in a nutshell.